On a stormy night, Luna, a solitary barn cat, rescues Wags, an abandoned puppy, sparking an extraordinary bond. Through threats, a fox attack, and community embrace, they forge a family against all odds. This heartwarming tale reveals how love transcends differences, proving the smallest hearts can teach the greatest lessons. Dive into heartwarming tales of extraordinary animal bonds, heroic rescues, and inspiring transformations. From loyal strays to unlikely animal friendships, we celebrate the resilience and love of creatures big and small. Join our community of animal lovers and discover stories that will move, uplift, and remind you of the magic of compassion. Subscribe now for your daily dose of positive vibes. The barn smelled of hay and earth, a familiar perfume that clung to Luna's sleek grey fur as she padded across the weathered wooden floor. It was late autumn, and the world outside the farm was painted in shades of amber and rust, the kind of beauty that made the air feel crisp and alive. Luna, a tabby with stripes like ripples on a pond, settled into her favorite spot, a soft pile of straw tucked beneath the loft. Her green eyes, sharp and soulful, glinted in the dim light filtering through the barn's cracked windows. This was her kingdom, small and quiet, but hers alone. Luna wasn't one for company. The farm's other animals, the clucking hens, the gruff old sheepdog, the chattering mice, kept their distance, and she liked it that way. She'd always been a solitary creature, content to watch the world from her perch, her tail flicking lazily as the days rolled by. But there was a stillness in her now, a heaviness that hadn't always been there. Last winter had been cruel. She'd had a litter of kittens, 3 tiny, mewling bundles of warmth she'd guarded with every ounce of her being. The cold had come too fast, though, seeping through the barn's walls, and one by one they'd slipped away. She'd buried her nose in their still fur, purring until her throat ached, willing them to wake. They never did. Since then, Luna had carried a quiet ache, a hollow space where her little ones had been. She didn't wail or wander like some might. She simply lived, hunting mice, napping in sunbeams, and keeping her heart tucked safely away. The farmer, old Jane, would sometimes leave a saucer of milk by the barn door, her rough hands lingering. As she muttered, "You're a good girl, Luna." But even Jane's kindness couldn't fill the emptiness. Luna was alone, and she'd made peace with it. Or so she thought. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold, Luna stretched out on her straw bed. The air was cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of frost. She closed, her eyes letting the familiar sounds of the farm lull her, the distant bleat of a sheep, the rustle of wind through the trees. It was a night like any other, or it should have been. But then, faintly, beneath the hum of the world, she heard a sound that didn't belong. It was a whimper, soft and trembling like a leaf caught in a breeze. Luna's ears twitched, her eyes snapping open. She lifted her head, peering into the shadows of the barn. Nothing moved. The sound came again, louder this time, drifting in from outside. Curiosity prickled at her, tugging her from her nest. She rose, silent as a whisper, and slipped toward the barn door, her paws barely stirring the dust. The night was darker now, the sky a deep velvet blue, and a chill hung in the air. Luna stepped out, her breath a faint mist, and scanned the yard. The farmhouse glowed in the distance, its windows warm with light, but the sound wasn't coming from there. It was closer, near the dirt path that wound past the barn toward the forest. She crept forward, her tail low, her senses sharp. The whimper grew into a series of small, desperate cries, and Luna's heart, guarded as it was, gave a tiny, unexpected lurch. There by the roadside sat a soggy cardboard box, its edges curling from the damp. The cries were coming from inside. Luna hesitated, her whiskers quivering. She didn't trust strange things, boxes, noises, anything that broke the rhythm of her world. But the sound pulled at her, a thread of need she couldn't ignore. She edged closer, peering over the rim. Inside, curled into a trembling ball, was a puppy. He was tiny, no bigger than one of her lost kittens, with matted brown fur and ears that flopped over his face. His eyes, big and brown and glistening with fear, locked onto hers. He let out another whimper, his little body shaking as he tried. to stand, only to collapse back into the box. He was soaked, hungry and alone. Abandoned, Luna realized, left to the mercy of the night. For a moment she just stared. This wasn't her business. Puppies belonged to dogs, to humans, not to a barn cat with no one to call her own. She could turn back, climb into her straw, and let the world sort itself out. But then, the puppy stretched, a paw toward her, a feeble, hopeful gesture, and something inside Luna cracked open. It was the same ache she'd felt for her kittens, the same pull that had made her purr through the cold. She didn't understand it, not fully, but she felt it, a whisper of warmth in her chest, soft and insistent. The wind picked up, rustling. The trees and a drop of rain splashed onto Luna's nose. She blinked, glancing at the sky. More drops followed, pattering against the box, making the puppy flinch. He whined again, and Luna's resolve hardened. She couldn't leave him here. Not like this. With a flick of her tail, she leaned into the box, her teeth closing gently around the scruff of his neck. He was heavier than she'd expected, his wet fur cold against her mouth, but she pulled, dragging him free of the cardboard. He squirmed, letting out a startled yip, but Luna held firm. Step by careful step, she hauled him back to the barn, his little legs dangling as she moved. The rain began to fall in earnest, drumming against the ground, but she didn't stop until they were inside, safe in the dry shadows. She set him down on the straw, her breath coming fast, and he flopped onto his side, panting. For a moment they just looked at each other, Luna wary and unsure, and the puppy weak but alive. She didn't know what she was doing. Cats didn't. Rescue puppies. They didn't curl around them, didn't share their warmth. But as the puppy shivered, his eyes half closed, Luna felt that hollow space in her heart shift. She lay down beside him, her body curving instinctively around his, and began to lick the rain from his fur. He sighed, a tiny sound of relief, and pressed closer. Outside, the storm raged on, but in the barn, there was only the soft rustle of the straw and the faint, steady rhythm of Luna's purr. She didn't know his name yet. Wags, she'd call him later, for the way his tail would wag like a metronome of joy. She didn't know the journey ahead, the love they'd build, the family they'd become. All she knew in that quiet, rain-soaked moment was that he needed her, and maybe, just maybe, she needed him too. The rain battered the barn's roof like a chorus of impatient fingers, a steady drum roll that filled the night with restless energy. Inside, Luna lay curled around the tiny puppy she'd dragged from the storm, her grey fur damp but warm against his shivering frame. The straw beneath them rustled softly as she shifted, her green eyes fixed on the little creature she'd pulled into her world. He was a pitiful sight, his brown fur matted with mud, his ears drooping like wilted leaves, and his body so small it barely filled the curve of her side. She didn't know where he'd come from or why he'd been left in that soggy box by the roadside, but one thing was clear: he was in trouble. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that made the puppy flinch, his tiny paws twitching against the straw. Luna's tail flicked, her instincts warring within her. She'd done her part, hadn't she? She'd brought him out of the rain, given him a dry spot to rest. That should have been enough. But as she watched him, something kept her rooted there. A pull she couldn't shake. He whimpered again, a sound so faint it nearly drowned beneath the rain's roar, but it pierced Luna all the same. His eyes, big, brown, and glistening with a mix of fear and exhaustion, opened just enough to meet hers. They were pleading, those eyes, like he was asking her for something she didn't know how to give. She tilted her head, whiskers quivering, and leaned closer. His breath was shallow, his little chest rising and falling too fast, too weak. He was cold, she realized, colder than he should have been, even with her warmth beside him. Luna's mind flashed back to that winter, to the kittens she'd lost. She remembered their fragile bodies growing still, the way their warmth had faded, no matter how tightly she'd held them. This puppy wasn't hers, he wasn't even a cat, but the memory clawed at her, sharp and raw. She couldn't let that happen again, not if she could help it. The barn was quiet, save for the storm, its shadows stretching long and dark across the walls. Luna rose, careful not to jostle the puppy, and padded toward the corner where old Jane sometimes left scraps. A crust of bread, a bit of cheese, whatever the farm's bounty spared. Tonight, there was nothing, just an empty saucer licked clean. By the wind. Luna's ears flattened. He needed food, something to fill his hollow belly, but the farmhouse was too far and the rain too fierce. She'd have to make do. She returned to the puppy, her steps silent, and nosed around the straw. There, a mouse she'd caught earlier, stashed beneath a loose plank. It wasn't much, just a small, limp thing, but it was fresh. She dragged it over, dropping it beside him. He didn't move at first, his eyes half closed, his body limp. Luna nudged him with her nose, a gentle push against his side. "Come on," she seemed to say, though no sound left her throat. "You've got to try." The puppy stirred, his head lifting just enough to sniff the air. His nose twitched, catching the scent, and he let out a weak, hopeful yip. Luna watched, her heart giving a strange, unfamiliar thud as he stretched toward the mouse. His jaws were clumsy, his teeth too small to do much, but he gnawed at it, tearing off tiny bites with a determination that surprised her. She sat back, tail curling around her paws, and let him eat. It wasn't enough, not nearly, but it was a start. The rain pounded harder, a gust of wind rattling the barn door, and the puppy shivered again. Luna's eyes narrowed. Food wasn't the only problem. He was still wet, his fur clinging to his skin like a sodden blanket, and the chill was seeping deeper. She'd seen what cold could do, how it stole life from the smallest things. She couldn't fix the storm, couldn't stop the night, but she could do this. With a soft huff, she lay down again, pressing herself closer. She draped her body over his, her warmth spilling into him, and began to lick his fur. Her tongue rasped against the mud and damp, smoothing it away, coaxing life back into his little frame. He squirmed at first, a faint protest, but then he settled, his head resting against her chest. His breathing slowed, steadier now, and a tiny sigh escaped him, a sound so small yet so full of trust that it caught Luna off guard. She paused, her tongue still on his ear, and looked at him. He was asleep, his eyes closed, his body nestled into hers like he belonged there. For a moment she just stared, the storm fading to a distant hum. This wasn't what she'd planned. She was a barn cat, a lone independent, not a mother to some lost puppy. But as she felt his warmth against her, the hollow space in her chest didn't feel quite so empty. It wasn't full, not yet, but it was softer, like the first thaw after a long freeze. Outside, the rain began to ease, its rhythm softening to a gentle patter. Lightning flickered, casting brief light through the cracks in the barn, and Luna saw him clearer. His fur a scruffy brown, his ears too big for his head, his tail a stub that twitched even in sleep. He was a mess, this little thing, but he was alive. And for tonight, that was enough. She didn't know who'd left him there, abandoned in that box by the road. Maybe it was a farmer who couldn't keep him, or a traveler passing through too, hurried to care. It didn't matter. He was here now, with her, and she'd made a choice she couldn't unmake. She lowered her head, resting her chin over his back, and closed her eyes. The storm could rage all it wanted. In this corner of the barn there was warmth, there was breath, and there was something new, a spark of something Luna hadn't felt in a long, long time. She didn't have a name for him yet. Wags, she'd call him later, when his tail found its rhythm and his spirit woke the barn with joy. For now he was just the puppy, the lost one she'd found. And as the night stretched on, Luna purred, a low, steady sound that wove through the rain, a promise she didn't know she'd keep. The rain had softened to a whisper by the time dawn crept over the farm, its grey light seeping through the barn's cracks like a shy guest. Luna hadn't slept. Her body remained curled around the puppy, her warmth a steady shield against the lingering chill, but her mind was restless. The straw beneath them was damp now, soaked from his wet fur and her own, and the air carried a bite that made her whiskers twitch. She lifted her head, green eyes narrowing as she studied the little creature pressed against her. He was still asleep, his breathing a faint rhythm that matched the drip of water from the roof. The mouse she'd given him lay half-eaten, beside his nose a small victory in a night of uncertainty. His fur, though still scruffy, was drier now thanks to her careful licking, and his shivers had eased. He looked less like a drowned thing and more like a puppy. Small, yes, but alive. Luna's tail flicked. Alive was good. Alive was enough. Wasn't it? She shifted, easing away from him just enough to stretch her stiff legs. He stirred, letting out a tiny whimper, and his paw reached for her, blindly seeking the warmth she'd left behind. Luna froze. That sound, that helpless reach, it tugged at her, sharp and insistent, like a claw snagging her heart. She could feel it pulling her back, urging her to stay, but another part of her resisted. This wasn't her place. Cats didn't raise puppies. They didn't share their nests, their food, their lives with something so different. She was a hunter, a loner, not a nursemaid. The barn was quiet now, the storm's fury spent, but the world outside was waking. A rooster crowed in the distance, its call cutting through the stillness, and the faint clatter of old Jane's boots echoed from the farmhouse. Luna's ears swiveled. Jane would come soon, as she always did, with her saucer of milk or a gruff word. Maybe she'd take the puppy, find him a proper home, somewhere with dogs, with humans who knew what to do with him. That would be best, wouldn't it? Luna could go back to her straw, her solitude, her simple life. No more whimpers, no more worry. But as she looked at him, sprawled in the nest she'd made, doubt gnawed at her. He was so small, so fragile. What if Jane didn't come soon enough? What if the cold crept back or the hunger grew too strong? She'd seen what happened to the weak. Her kittens, their tiny bodies fading in the dark. The memory stung, a fresh wound she couldn't outrun. She'd been helpless then, powerless against the winter's grip. But this time, she'd acted. She'd pulled him from the rain, kept him breathing. Could she really walk away now? The puppy whimpered again, louder this time, his eyes fluttering open. They found hers, big and brown and trusting, and he let out a weak, hopeful yip. His tail, short and stubby, gave a faint twitch, the first sign of life beyond survival. Luna's chest tightened. He was trying, this little thing, fighting to hold on. And he was looking at her, not the barn, not the world outside, but her, like she was his anchor in a storm she hadn't even known was coming. She turned away, pacing a tight circle on the barn floor. Her claws clicked against the wood, a restless rhythm that matched the churn in her mind. She could leave him here, wait for Jane. It was the sensible thing, the cat thing. She didn't owe him anything, did she? But then the rain picked up again, a sudden heavy patter that rattled the roof and sent a gust of cold air through the cracks. The puppy flinched, curling tighter into the straw, and his cries grew sharper, more desperate. Luna stopped. The sound cut through her like a blade, slicing away the walls she'd built around herself. She remembered the box, the way he'd been left there alone and forgotten. She remembered her kittens, how she'd purred for them, even when hope was gone. And she remembered the warmth of this puppy against her, the way his breathing had steadied, under her care. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something bigger, something she couldn't name but could feel, a thread tying her to him. Fragile but real. The rain pounded harder, a deluge now, and water began to trickle through a gap in the wall, pooling near the straw. The puppy yelped, his little body trembling as the cold crept closer. Luna's ears flattened, her resolve snapping into place. She couldn't wait for Jane, couldn't trust the world to fix this. Not yet. He needed her now, and she needed to know he'd be okay. With a determined flick of her tail, she darted back to him. He was struggling, his paws slipping in the wet straw, his cries growing frantic. Luna didn't hesitate this time. She leaned down, her teeth closing gently around his scruff, and lifted him. He was heavier than before, his body limp with exhaustion, but she held firm. His yips quieted to a soft whine as she carried him across the barn, away from the leak, to a higher, drier corner beneath the loft. She set him down on a fresh pile of straw, her breath coming fast. He flopped onto his side, panting, but his eyes stayed on her, wide and grateful. Luna didn't look away. She lay beside him, curling her body around his once more, her warmth enveloping him like a promise. The rain roared outside, but here, in this small space, it couldn't touch them. She began to lick him again, smoothing his fur, chasing away the damp and the fear. He pressed closer, his head nestling under her chin, and a tiny sigh escaped him. Luna's purr rumbled to life, low and steady, a sound she hadn't made since that winter. It wasn't just for him, it was for her too, a release of the ache she'd carried too long. She didn't know what this meant, didn't understand why she'd chosen this path. Cats didn't rescue puppies, but this one had. And as the dawn light grew brighter, painting the barn in soft gold, Luna knew she wouldn't turn back. He didn't have a name yet. Wags, she'd call him later when his spirit bloomed and his tail danced with joy. For now he was hers, and she was his. The storm could rage, the world could wait. In this moment, they were enough. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the barn, and Luna led him back to the straw. He was tired now, his steps slowing, and she nudged him down, curling around him as she had the night before. He nestled into her, his head resting on her paws, and let out a contented sigh. She licked his ears, smoothing the last of the day's chaos from his fur, and his tail gave one final wag before he drifted off. Luna watched him sleep, her purr a steady hum in the quiet. He was stronger, now thanks to her, thanks to the food she'd found, the warmth she'd shared, the lessons she'd taught. She wasn't a dog, wasn't built for this, but she'd done it anyway. And as the light faded, painting the barn in hues of amber and dusk, she realized something. He wasn't just surviving. He was hers. She didn't call him Wags yet. That name would come later when his tail became a blur of happiness. For now, he was the puppy, the one she'd chosen. And as the farm settled into night, Luna rested her chin over him, her heart a little fuller, a little warmer than it had been before. The morning sun climbed higher, spilling golden light across the farm and chasing the last of the night's chill from the barn. Luna lounged on her hay bale, her green eyes half closed as she watched the puppy explore the floor below. He was bolder now, his wobbly steps steadier after a few days of her care. His brown fur, though still scruffy, had a hint of shine, and his tail, short and eager, wagged with every discovery. A stray feather, a loose nail, a patch of sunlight to pounce on. Luna's tail flicked, a quiet pride stirring in her chest. He was growing, this little thing she'd pulled from the storm, and she'd made that happen. A sharp bark broke her reverie, and she glanced down to see him tugging at a bit of twine, his paws scrabbling against the wood. He looked up at her, eyes bright, and she purred, a soft, involuntary sound that had become more frequent lately. She leapt down, brushing against him as she landed, and he nuzzled her side, his warmth a familiar comfort. They'd settled into a rhythm, the two of them, her hunting scraps, him trailing after her, their days a quiet dance of care and play. But the barn wasn't theirs alone, and the world outside was stirring. The creak of the barn door startled them both. Luna's ears swiveled, her body tensing as she turned toward the sound. The puppy froze mid-step, his tail stilling, and then the door swung open, letting in a flood of light and the familiar scent of earth and tobacco. Old Farmer Jane stepped inside, her boots thudding against the floor, her grey hair pulled back. Beneath a weathered cap, she carried a saucer of milk in one hand and a burlap sack in the other, her lined face set in its usual gruff lines. "Well now," Jane muttered, her voice rough as gravel. "Let's see what the night left us." Luna didn't move, her eyes locked on Jane. She knew the farmer well, knew the milk was for her, knew the muttered words were kinder than they sounded. But today was different. Today, there was the puppy, and Luna felt a flicker of unease. She stepped forward, placing herself between him and Jane, her tail low but steady. He whimpered behind her, pressing close, and she felt his heartbeat against her flank, fast, uncertain. Jane's gaze landed on them, and her brows shot up, the saucer nearly slipping from her hand. "What in the blazes?" She set the milk down, squinting as she took a step closer. "Luna girl, what have you got there?" The puppy peeked out from behind Luna, his ears flopping as he tilted his head. He let out a small, curious bark, and Jane stopped short, her mouth twitching into something that might have been a smile if it weren't so surprised. "A pup? Here? Where'd you come from, little fella?" Luna's fur bristled, her instincts flaring. She didn't hiss, not yet, but her stance was firm, a silent claim. He was hers, this scruffy bundle of noise and warmth, and she wasn't sure what Jane's presence meant. Would she take him? Send him away? The thought made Luna's claws flex against the wood, a quiet warning she couldn't voice. Jane crouched, her knees creaking, and peered at them. "Well, I'll be. You're a sight, ain't you?" She reached out a hand, rough and calloused, and the puppy flinched, ducking back behind Luna. But Jane didn't push. She sat back on her heels, her eyes flicking between them, taking in the way Luna shielded him, the way he clung to her like she was his whole world. "You found him, didn't you?" Jane said, her tone softening. "Out in that storm, I reckon. Poor thing looks half drowned still." Luna didn't relax, but she didn't move either, her gaze steady. Jane chuckled, a low, raspy sound, and shook her head. "Never thought I'd see the day, a cat playing mama to a dog." "You're full of surprises, Luna." The storm had faded by mid-morning, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a farm glistening with dew. Inside the barn, the air was still cool, but the golden light streaming through the cracks softened its edges. Luna sat perched on a low beam, her tail swaying lazily as she watched the puppy below. He was awake now, sprawled in the dry straw she'd moved him to, his brown eyes blinking up at her with a mix of curiosity and confusion. His fur was a tangled mess, sticking up in odd tufts where she'd licked it dry, but he was alive. More than alive, even. He was starting to stir. Luna's ears twitched as he let out a small, raspy bark, his first real sound since the whimpers of the night before. It startled her, that bark, sharp and loud in the quiet barn, nothing like the soft mew she was used to. She tilted her head, studying him. He was steadier now, his legs wobbling less, though he still looked like a puff of fluff that might blow away in a breeze. She'd kept him warm through the night, her body a shield against the cold, and that had made a difference. But warmth wasn't enough. He needed more: food, care, something to keep that spark in his eyes growing. She leapt down, landing silently beside him, and he flinched, tumbling backward into the straw with a surprised yip. Luna froze, her whiskers quivering. He was so clumsy, this little thing, nothing like the sure-footed kittens she'd once guided. But as he righted himself, his tail gave a tiny wag, and he looked at her with such unguarded trust that her chest tightened. She didn't know how to do this, how to mother something that barked instead of purred, but she'd figure it out. She had to. First, food. The mouse from last night was gone, its scraps scattered in the straw, and his belly was still too small to hold much. Luna padded to the barn door, peering out at the yard. The grass sparkled with raindrops, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke from the farmhouse. Old Jane would be out soon, maybe with milk or scraps, but Luna couldn't wait. She turned back, nosing around the barn's corners until she found a forgotten crust of bread tucked behind a barrel. It was stale, a bit moldy on one edge, but it would do. She carried it to him, dropping it at his paws. He sniffed it, his nose wrinkling, then attacked it with gusto, his tiny teeth gnashing at the crust. Crumbs flew everywhere, sticking to his fur, and Luna watched with a mix of amusement and exasperation. He ate like a storm himself, messy, eager, unstoppable. When he finished, he licked his chops and looked up at her, his tail wagging harder now, a little metronome of joy. She huffed, a soft sound that wasn't quite a purr, and began to lick the crumbs from his face. He squirmed, batting at her with a paw, but she held firm, her tongue smoothing his fur until he settled. Next came movement. He couldn't just lie there all day. He needed strength, needed to learn his legs. Luna nudged him, her nose firm against his side, urging him to stand. He wobbled, his paws slipping on the straw, but he tried, staggering forward with a determination that made her ears perk. She stepped back, giving him space, and he followed, tottering after her like a shadow with a heartbeat. His barks grew, bolder, echoing off the barn walls, and Luna flicked her tail, leading him in a slow circle around the floor. It was awkward, this dance of theirs. He'd lunge too far and tumble or trip over his own ears, and she'd pause, waiting for him to catch up. Once he crashed into her legs, and she let out a startled meow, leaping aside as he rolled into the straw with a delighted yip. She stared at him, her dignity ruffled, but his grin, yes, a grin, all teeth and brightness, melted her irritation. She couldn't help it. She purred, a low rumble that surprised her as much as it did him. The day wore on, and Luna found a rhythm. She'd coax him to eat, bits of bread, a scrap of cheese she'd scavenged from Jane's morning rounds, and then guide him around the barn, teaching him to toddle without falling. He was clumsy, yes, but quick to learn, and his energy grew with every step. By afternoon, he was chasing her tail, his paws slapping the floor as he barked with glee. Luna darted away, leaping onto a hay bale, and he skidded to a stop below, looking up at her with those big, pleading eyes. She hesitated, then jumped down, brushing against him as she landed. He pressed close, his warmth seeping into her, and she felt that hollow space in her chest shift again. It wasn't just about keeping him alive anymore. It was about this, the play, the trust, the way he looked at her like she was his whole world. She didn't understand it, not fully, but she felt it growing, a bond she hadn't meant to forge. The puppy, emboldened by Jane's stillness, edged forward, his nose twitching toward the saucer. Luna tensed, ready to pull him back, but Jane slid it closer, her movements slow. "Go on then," she said. "Ain't much, but it'll help." He lapped at the milk, his tongue clumsy but eager, and Luna watched, her ears easing back. Jane stayed where she was, her eyes warm now, crinkling at the corners. "He's a scrapper, that one. Must have been lost or left. Good thing you were here, girl." The words settled over Luna like a blanket, unexpected and soft. She blinked, her guard slipping just a fraction. Jane reached into her sack, pulling out a scrap of ham, left over from breakfast by the smell, and tossed it gently toward them. The puppy pounced, tumbling over his own paws, and Luna let him have it, her purr rumbling faintly as he gnawed at the prize. Jane stood, brushing her, hands on her overalls. "Reckon you've got this under control," she said, glancing at Luna, "but I'll leave a bit extra from now on. Can't have you starving while you raise that rascal." She turned to go, then paused, looking back over her shoulder. "You're a strange little family, you two. Strange and sweet." With that, she shuffled out, the door creaking shut. Behind her, leaving the barn quiet once more. Luna exhaled, her tension melting as the puppy licked ham grease from his nose. He toddled back to her, pressing against her side, and she licked his head, smoothing his fur. Jane's words lingered. Family. It was a strange word, one Luna hadn't thought of since her kittens. But as she felt his warmth, heard his contented sigh, it didn't feel wrong. The day stretched on and Jane kept her promise. A saucer of milk appeared each morning, sometimes with a crust of bread or a bone for the puppy. Luna accepted it, her wariness fading, and the barn became a haven of small comforts. He grew stronger, his barks louder, his tail a blur of motion she'd later name him for, Wags. And through it all, Jane watched from a distance, her gruff voice softening whenever she spoke of Luna and her pup. Luna didn't know what the future held, didn't know the challenges or joys ahead. But as she curled around him that night, his head tucked under her chin, she felt something settle. Jane had seen them, had blessed them in her own rough way, and that made it real. They were a family, strange and sweet just as she'd said. The days stretched into a golden autumn haze, the farm alive with the rustle of leaves and the crisp bite of morning frost. Inside the barn, Luna and the puppy had carved out a world of their own. A quiet corner where the sun painted stripes across the floor and the air smelled of hay and possibility. He wasn't just the puppy anymore, not in Luna's mind at least. His tail, short and stubby, had taken on a life of its own, wagging with every step, every bark, every glance her way. Wags, she'd started to think of him as though she hadn't the words to say it. It fit him, this bundle of energy she'd pulled from the storm. Luna perched on her hay bale, her green eyes tracking him as he bounded across the barn. He'd grown in the days since Jane's discovery, still small, still scruffy, but stronger now, his legs steadier beneath him. The milk and scraps Jane left had worked their magic, filling out his ribs, giving his fur a faint sheen. He darted toward a stray feather, pouncing with a bark that echoed off the walls, and Luna's tail flicked, a ripple of amusement running through her. He was a whirlwind, this Wags, all noise and motion where she was stillness and stealth. She leapt down, landing silently softly beside him, and he froze, ears perked as he watched her. She nudged him with her nose, a gentle encouragement, and he took off again, chasing her tail as it swayed just out of reach. His paws slapped the floor, clumsy but determined, and he let out a yip of delight when he nearly caught it, tumbling into a pile of straw instead. Luna paused, her dignity ruffled, but his grin, teeth flashing, eyes bright, melted her resolve. She purred, a low hum that vibrated through the barn and batted at him with a paw, sending him rolling with a playful bark. Their mornings became a dance of chase and rest. She'd lead him around the barn, her movements sleek and precise while he followed, tripping over his own ears or skidding into a barrel. He mimicked her, trying to stalk like she did, crouching low, his tail wagging despite his efforts to be sneaky. Once he lunged at a shadow on the wall only to crash into it with a startled yelp, and Luna leapt to his side, licking his face as he shook off the surprise. Her purr grew louder, a sound she couldn't hold back, and he pressed against her, his warmth a steady comfort. Afternoons were for napping. The sun would climb high, spilling light through the cracks, and they'd curl up together in the straw, Luna's body a crescent around his head tucked under her chin. His breathing slowed, matching hers, and she'd groom him, her tongue smoothing his fur as he sighed in contentment. The hollow space in her chest, the one she'd carried since her kittens, felt softer now, filled with the rhythm of his heart against hers. She didn't question it anymore. This bond, this strange, sweet thing they'd built, it was theirs and it was enough. Evenings brought play again. Wags would chase bits of twine Jane tossed in, his tail a blur, while Luna watched from her perch, her eyes glinting with pride. He'd bring his treasures back to her, a feather, a stick, once even a muddy leaf, dropping them at her paws like offerings. She'd sniff them, her whiskers twitching, then nudge them aside to lick his face, her purr a quiet thank you. He'd flop beside her, panting, and she'd rest her chin over him, their shadows merging in the fading light. One crisp afternoon, Jane lingered longer, leaning against the doorframe as Wags chased Luna across the barn. "Look at 'em go," she chuckled, her voice rough but warm. "You've got yourself a shadow, Luna." Wags skidded to a stop, barking up at Jane, and Luna paused beside him, her stance protective but relaxed. Jane tossed a crust of bread, and he pounced, tumbling into Luna's legs. She meowed, a sharp note of mock indignation, and Jane laughed, a rare, full sound that filled the barn. "Ain't nobody gonna split you two up," she said, and Luna's ears eased back, a quiet trust settling in. Night fell and the barn grew still. The world outside hushed under a blanket of stars. Luna led Wags to their nest, her tail guiding him through the shadows. He toddled after her, his energy spent, and flopped into the straw with a contented grunt. She curled around him, her warmth enveloping his, and began to groom him, slow, steady strokes that smoothed the day's chaos from his fur. His tail gave a final wag, then stilled, and he nestled closer, his nose buried in her fur. Luna rested her head over his, her purr a steady hum that wove through the quiet. He was hers now, this Wags, hers in a way she hadn't expected, hadn't known she needed. She'd taught him to walk, to eat, to play, and he'd taught her something too, how to let the hollow fill, how to let love grow where loss had been. She didn't think of the storm anymore, or the box by the road. She thought of this, his breath against her, his trust in her, the life they'd made together. The barn settled into silence, save for the soft rustle of straw and the faint creak of wood. Outside, the farm slept, but here in their corner, there was warmth. There was peace. Luna's eyes drifted shut, her purr fading to a whisper, and she felt him there. Wags, her shadow, her joy. They were more than a cat and a puppy now. They were a bond growing stronger with every day, every chase, every nap. And as the night stretched on, Luna knew. This was home. The barn glowed with the soft amber of late afternoon, the kind of light that made the world feel warm and slow. Luna lounged on her hay bale, her green eyes half closed as she watched Wags tumble across the floor. He was a blur of scruffy brown fur now, his legs stronger, his tail a constant wag that stirred the straw. He'd found a stick Jane had tossed in earlier, a gnarled, muddy thing, and was gnawing at it with fierce determination, his barks muffled by the wood. Luna's purr rumbled faintly, a quiet thread of contentment woven through the day. They'd built something here, she and Wags, a rhythm of play and rest, a life that felt steady, safe. The barn door creaked open, and Luna's ears swiveled, her gaze sharpening. Jane stepped in, her boots heavy on the floor, but she wasn't alone. A man followed, tall, broad-shouldered, with a cap pulled low over his eyes. His voice was loud, cutting through the barn's peace like a blade. "Aunt Jane, you weren't kidding about the cat and the pup. Look at 'em." Luna tensed, her tail stilling. She didn't know this man, Jane's nephew, she'd learn later, come to help with the harvest, but his presence set her on edge. Wags dropped his stick, his head tilting as he barked a greeting, his tail wagging harder. The man laughed, a sharp sound, and crouched down, clapping his hands. "Hey, little guy, come here." Wags bounded forward, his trust boundless, but Luna leapt from her perch, landing between them with a silent grace. Her fur bristled, her eyes locked on the stranger. He wasn't Jane, didn't carry her quiet kindness, her understanding. Wags bumped into her legs, yipping in confusion, and she nudged him back, her stance firm. He was hers to protect, this joyful, reckless thing, and she didn't like the way the man's hands reached out. Jane chuckled, setting a saucer of milk by the door. "Easy, Luna, that's just Tommy, my nephew. He's harmless, mostly." She glanced at him, her tone dry. "Ain't that right?" Tommy grinned, standing up. Sure. Just never seen a cat play mama to a dog before. Where'd he come from, anyway?" "Storm brought him," Jane said, her voice softening as she watched Wags nudge past Luna to lap at the milk. "Luna found him, half dead in a box. Been raising him ever since." Tommy whistled, low and long. "That's something. But her cat raising a pup? That ain't natural, Aunt Jane. He needs a proper home. Somewhere with dogs, folks who can handle him when he gets big." Luna's ears flattened, a low growl building in her throat. She didn't understand the words, but she felt the shift, the way Tommy's eyes lingered on Wags, the way his tone carried a weight she didn't trust. Jane frowned, crossing her arms. "He's doing fine here. Luna's got him sorted." Tommy shrugged, his grin fading. "For now, maybe. But he's a dog, not a kitten. He'll outgrow her. Need more'n a barn and a cat can give. I know a guy, owns a farm down the road, got a litter of pups. They'd take him, raise him right." The air in the barn thickened, the warmth leaching away. Luna stepped closer to Wags, her body a shield as he licked milk from his nose. He sensed her tension, his tail slowing, and he pressed against her, a soft whimper escaping him. She licked his head, quick and firm, her purr gone. Take him, away from her. The thought clawed at her, sharp and cold, stirring memories of loss, of kittens she couldn't save, of a hollow she'd only just begun to fill. Jane's voice hardened. "He ain't going nowhere, Tommy. Luna's his family. You see how she looks at him." Tommy raised his hands, backing off a step. "Just saying, Aunt Jane, dogs need dogs. I could take him tomorrow, save you the trouble." Tomorrow, the word hung there, a threat Luna couldn't name but could feel. She growled again, louder now, her claws flexing against the wood. Wags whimpered, ducking behind her, and she felt his fear, small trembling, needing her. She wouldn't let him go. Not to this man, not to anyone. He was hers, her shadow, her joy, her Wags. Jane stepped forward, her shadow falling over them. "Enough. Tommy, he stays, that's final." Tommy sighed, scratching his neck. "Your call, I guess. Just seems a waste leaving him with a cat." He turned to go, his boots thudding out into the yard, but the weight of his words lingered. Luna didn't move, her eyes tracking him, until the door swung shut, leaving them in silence. Jane knelt, her rough hand hovering near Wags. He peeked out, his tail giving a cautious wag, and she smiled, a rare, soft thing. "Don't you worry, little fella. Ain't nobody taking you from your mama." She glanced at Luna, her eyes warm. "You're a fierce one, girl. Good on you." Luna relaxed, just a fraction, her growl fading to a huff. Jane set a bone by the milk, a peace offering maybe, and shuffled out, her mutterings lost to the wind. The barn settled, the light dimming as evening crept in, and Luna turned to Wags. He was trembling still, his eyes wide, and she licked his face, slow and steady, until his tail wagged again. She led him to their nest, curling around him as the shadows lengthened, her warmth chasing away the day's unease. He pressed close, his head under her chin, and let out a sigh, a sound so small, yet so full of trust that it steadied her. She purred, a low rumble that filled the quiet and felt him relax against her. Tommy's words echoed, a distant threat, but Jane stood stronger. He stayed, with her, where he belonged. The night deepened, the farm hushed under a sky pricked with stars. Luna rested her chin over Wags, her heart a steady beat against his. He wasn't going anywhere, not tomorrow, not ever, if she could help it. They were a family, strange and sweet, and no one would break that. Not while she breathed. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the farm bathed in a light that turned the frost-kissed grass to silver. Luna lay curled around Wags in their straw nest, her purr a faint hum as he slept, his scruffy head tucked under her chin. The unease from Tommy's visit lingered, a shadow at the edge of her mind, but the barn felt safe again, quiet, theirs. She'd kept Wags close all night, her warmth a shield against the world outside, and his steady breathing had lulled her into a fragile peace. They were together. That was enough. The barn door banged open, shattering the stillness. Luna's eyes snapped wide, her ears swiveling as she lifted her head. Wags stirred, a sleepy whimper escaping him, but she pressed him down with a paw, her body tensing. Heavy boots thudded against the floor, too loud, too fast, and Tommy's voice cut through the air, sharp and unwelcome. "All right, Aunt Jane. Let's get this done quick. Where's the pup?" Jane's reply was gruff, trailing behind him. "Tommy, I told you, he stays. Don't go stirring trouble." Luna rose, her fur bristling as Tommy stepped into view. He carried a burlap sack, its mouth gaping open, and his cap was tilted back, revealing a determined glint in his eyes. "Ain't trouble, just sense," he said, scanning the barn. "He'll be better off with that farmer down the road. Dogs need dogs, not cats." Wags peeked out from the straw, his tail wagging uncertainly as he barked, a small, hopeful sound. Tommy's gaze locked onto him, and he grinned, crouching low. "There. You are, little guy. Come here, let's get you sorted." Luna's growl rumbled deep in her chest, a warning that vibrated through the barn. She stepped forward, placing herself between Tommy and Wags, her claws unsheathing against the wood. Her tail lashed, her green eyes blazing with a fierceness she'd never shown before. He wasn't taking Wags, not now, not ever. She'd pulled him from the storm, fed him, warmed him, taught him to live. He was hers, her shadow, her heart, and no stranger would rip that away. Tommy hesitated, his grin faltering. "Easy, cat. I ain't here to hurt nobody." He reached out, slow but sure, his hand inching toward Wags. Luna lunged. Her hiss was a razor's edge, her body arching as she swiped at his hand, claws flashing in the light. Tommy yanked back, cursing as a thin red line bloomed across his knuckles. "Damn it! Crazy cat!" Wags yelped, scrambling behind Luna, his tail tucking as he pressed against her. She felt his fear, his trembling, and it fueled her. She hissed again, louder, her fur puffed to twice her size, her stance unyielding. Tommy wasn't Jane. He didn't understand, didn't see what they were. To him, Wags was just a pup to be handed off, a problem to solve. But to Luna, he was everything. The light in her days, the warmth in her nights, the family she'd fought to keep. Jane pushed past Tommy, her face stormy. "I told you, boy, leave him be. Look at her, she'd tear you to shreds before she let you take him." Tommy rubbed his hand, glaring at Luna. "She's a cat, Aunt Jane. She can't raise a dog proper. He needs her." Jane snapped, her voice like thunder. "You see that? She's his mama, claws and all, ain't your place to decide." Wags whimpered, his nose nudging Luna's flank, and she turned just enough to lick his head, quick and firm, her eyes never leaving Tommy. He needed her now, needed her strength, her stand, and she wouldn't falter. Her growl softened, but her posture held a silent vow. Try it. I dare you. Tommy straightened, the sack dangling limp in his grip. Fine, he muttered, stepping back. But when he gets too big for her, don't say I didn't warn you. He shot Luna a dark look, then turned for the door, his boots stomping out into the yard. Jane lingered, her hands on her hips as the barn settled into quiet. She looked at Luna, then at Wags, who peeked out from behind her, his tail giving a cautious wag. A smile tugged at her lips, softening the lines of her face. You're something else, girl, she said, her voice low. Fierce as a lion. When it counts. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a scrap of bacon and tossed it gently toward them. Wags darted for it, his fear forgotten, and Luna let him go, her fur smoothing as she sat back. Jane nodded, a quiet approval in her eyes. He stays with you. That's that. She turned to leave, her mutterings fading as the door creaked. Shut. Luna exhaled, her tension unraveling like a thread pulled loose. Wags bounded back, bacon grease on his nose, and flopped against her, his tail wagging hard enough to stir the straw. She licked his face, slow and steady, chasing away the last of his trembling. He pressed closer, his warmth seeping into her, and she felt the weight of her stand settle, solid, real, unbreakable. The barn grew still, the morning light stretching long and warm across the floor. Luna curled around Wags, her purr rumbling to life, a sound that filled the space between them. He'd nearly been taken, nearly lost to her, but she'd fought, and she'd won. Jane's words echoed, "He stays with you." It wasn't just a promise, it was truth, carved into the air, into her heart. Wags sighed, his head resting on her paws, and she rested her chin over him, her eyes drifting shut. He was hers, her Wags, her family, and no one would change that. Not Tommy, not the world outside. The farm hummed with life beyond the barn, but here in their nest there was only them, safe together, whole. The day stretched on, and Luna held him close, her purr a steady hymn to their victory. They'd face the threat, and they'd come. Through? She didn't know what else might come, but she knew this. She'd stand again and again for him. Always. The night stretched on, the stars holding vigil overhead. Luna didn't move, didn't let go, her chin resting over him as her breath steadied. The fox was gone, its threat banished, but the moment lingered. A test she'd faced, a trust she'd earned. She'd fought for him, bled for him, and he'd stayed with her, needing her as much as she needed him. Morning would bring Jane, would bring light to see the scratches and the blood. But for now, there was only this. Wags, warm and breathing, and Luna, his guardian, his family. Her purr filled the barn, a hymn to their survival, and she knew, whatever came next, they'd face it together. The morning sun rose gentle and golden, spilling light over the farm and chasing the night's shadows from the barn. Luna lay in their straw nest, her grey fur matted with dried blood from the fox's bite, her legs stiff but resting. Wags nestled against her, his scruffy brown head tucked under her chin, his tail giving a faint wag even in sleep. The fight had left its mark, on her body, on the quiet of their haven, but they'd come through it together, and that was enough. Her purr rumbled softly, a steady thread of comfort as she licked his ears, smoothing the last of his fear away. The barn door creaked open, and Luna's ears twitched, her eyes narrowing as she lifted her head. Old Jane stepped inside, her boots slower than usual, her face creased with something new, worry maybe, or wonder. She stopped short, her gaze landing on the scratches in the wood, the tufts of russet fur scattered near the wall, and then on Luna, bloodied but unbowed. "Lord Almighty," she muttered, her voice rough but soft. "What happened here?" Wags stirred, his eyes blinking open, and he barked, a small, bright sound that broke the tension. Jane's gaze shifted to him, then back to Luna, and understanding dawned. "A fox, wasn't it? Snuck in last night. And you fought it off, didn't you, girl?" Luna didn't move, her body still curled protectively around Wags, but her purr deepened. A quiet answer. Jane knelt, her knees creaking, and reached out a hand, not to touch, just to hover, as if honoring the space they'd claimed. "Look at you," she said, her tone warm with awe. "Took on a fox for this little rascal. You're a wonder, Luna." Wags wagged harder, toddling toward Jane, and she chuckled, pulling a biscuit from her pocket. He snatched it, tumbling back to Luna's side, and she licked the crumbs from his nose, her eyes never leaving Jane. The farmer stood, brushing her hands on her overalls. "Word's gonna spread about this. Can't keep a story like yours quiet." And spread it did. About noon, the farm buzzed with voices. Neighbors, friends, folks from down the road who'd heard Jane's tale over coffee at the feed store. They trickled into the yard, their boots crunching on gravel, their murmurs carrying through the barn's open door. Luna tensed at first, her instincts flaring, but Wags barked with delight, his tail a blur as he peeked out at the newcomers. She stayed close, her fur smoothing as she felt Jane's steady presence nearby. A woman with a braid and a basket stepped in first, her eyes wide. "That's the cat? And the pup? Heard she fought a fox for him." She set down a tin of sardines, a treat for Luna, and Wags bounded over, sniffing eagerly. Luna followed, her limp slight but proud, and the woman smiled. "Brave little mama, ain't you?" Next came a man with a weathered hat, his kids trailing behind. "Brought something for the hero," he said, tossing a rawhide bone Wags' way. The pup pounced, tumbling into the straw, and the kids giggled, clapping as Luna nudged him back to his feet. "Never seen a cat do that," the man said, shaking his head. "She's something special." More came, old Mrs. Carter with a knitted blanket, young Sam with a handful of jerky, even Tommy lingering at the back with a sheepish nod. "I guess I was wrong about 'em," he muttered to Jane, who smirked and handed him a broom. "Sweep up then, they've earned their piece." The barn filled with gifts, food, toys, a saucer of cream Jane set by Luna's perch. Wags darted. Between them, his barks a joyful chorus while Luna watched, her green eyes glinting with a mix of wariness and wonder. The people didn't crowd, didn't push, just stood at a distance, their voices soft with admiration. "She's his mama, all right," one said. "Look how he sticks to her," said another. "Ain't that the sweetest thing?" Jane stayed, near, her gruff voice cutting through now and then. "Give 'em space, folks, they've had a night." But her eyes crinkled with pride, and when Wags flopped against Luna with a new toy, a rag doll from a girl in pigtails, she nodded. "See? Told you they're a family." The farm settled into a crisp evening, the sky a deep indigo pricked with stars that cast faint light over the barn. Luna lay beside Wags in their straw nest, her grey fur blending into the shadows as she watched him sleep. His scruffy brown body rose and fell with each breath, his tail twitching faintly, a sign of dreams filled with chases and play. The day's tension with Tommy had faded, leaving behind a quiet victory Luna felt in her bones. Wags was hers, safe under Jane's gruff blessing, and the barn was their haven once more. She rested her chin over him, her purr a soft hum that lulled them both into peace. A rustle broke the stillness, sharp, deliberate, not the wind. Luna's ears swiveled, her eyes snapping open as she lifted her head. The sound came again, closer, now from the far corner where the barn wall met the floorboards. A faint scrabble, a whisper of movement. Her fur prickled, her instincts flaring. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. Wags stirred, a sleepy whimper escaping him as he sensed her tension. She nudged him silent, her nose firm against his flank, and rose to her paws, her body low and taut. The barn was dark, save for slivers of starlight piercing the cracks, but her eyes adjusted, sharp and searching. There, a shadow moved, sleek and swift, slipping through a gap where the wood had warped. A fox, its russet fur glinting as it crept inside, its nose twitching toward the scent of Wags. Luna's growl rumbled low, a warning that vibrated through the straw. The fox froze, its amber eyes locking onto hers, glinting with hunger and cunning. It was lean, wiry, built for stealth and bigger than her, too big for a lone cat to face easily. But Wags was behind her, small and vulnerable, his warmth still pressed against her memory. She couldn't back down. Not now, not ever, the fox. Took a step, its claws clicking softly against the wood, and Luna arched her back, her fur puffing to twice her size. She hissed, a sound like tearing silk, her claws unsheathing as she held her ground. Wags whimpered louder, scrambling to his feet, his tail tucking as he peeked out from behind her. The fox's gaze shifted to him, its lips curling in a silent snarl, and Luna felt a surge of fire in her chest. He was hers, her Wags, her heart, and this intruder wouldn't touch him. She lunged, a blur of grey fury, her claws slashing at the fox's muzzle. It yelped, rearing back, but it was quicker than she'd expected, and snapped at her, its teeth grazing her shoulder. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but Luna twisted free, her hiss rising to a yowl that echoed through the barn. Wags barked, a small frantic sound, and darted toward her, his instinct to help outweighing his fear. "No!" She seemed to cry, shoving him back with a paw as the fox lunged again. The barn erupted into chaos, claws and teeth, snarls and barks. Luna fought with everything she had, her small body a whirlwind of defiance. She raked the fox's flank, dodged its jaws, her yowls piercing the night as she drove it back. It snapped at her tail, missing by a whisker, and she leapt onto a barrel, using the height to slash at its eyes. The fox snarled, blood streaking its fur, but it wouldn't retreat. Not yet. Wags barked again, louder, his voice breaking with panic as he tottered toward her. Luna's heart lurched. He was too close, too exposed, and the fox turned, its hunger fixing on him. Time slowed. She saw its muscles coil, saw Wags freeze, his big eyes wide with terror. She didn't think. She leapt, throwing herself between them, her claws sinking into the fox's shoulder as she slammed it to the ground. They rolled, a tangle of fur and fury, and Luna felt its teeth clamp onto her leg, a jolt of pain that made her vision blur. But she didn't let go. She clawed at its face, her yowl a roar now, until the fox yelped and broke free, scrambling for the gap it had come through. Luna staggered to her feet, her breath ragged, and chased it, hissing until it vanished into the night, its tail a fleeting streak against the dark. The barn fell silent save for the pounding of her heart. Luna stood there trembling, blood matting her fur where the fox had bitten her. She turned, limping back to Wags, who cowered in the straw, his whimpers soft and broken. He looked up at her, his tail still, his eyes glistening with fear and trust. She sank beside him, her body aching, and licked his face, slow and steady, chasing away his terror. He pressed against her, trembling but alive, and she curled around him, her warmth enveloping his. Her leg throbbed, her shoulder stung, but she didn't care. He was safe, she'd kept him safe. Her purr started, faint at first, then stronger, a sound that wove through the pain and the quiet. Wags sighed, his head nestling into her fur, and she felt his trust, absolute, unshaken, a bond forged in the heat of that fight. As dusk fell, the visitors drifted away, leaving the barn quieter but richer. Luna surveyed the hall, sardines jerky, a bone Wags gnawed happily beside her, and felt the weight of their story settle. The community had seen them not just as a cat and a pup, but as something more, something worth celebrating. She licked Wags's head, her purr steady, and he pressed closer, his warmth a familiar anchor. Jane lingered last, spreading the blanket over their nest. "You're famous now, you two," she said, her tone teasing but warm. "Whole farm's talking about the cat who fought a fox for her pup." She paused, her hand resting on the doorframe. "Reckon you've earned this place. Ain't nobody gonna question it now." The door creaked shut and the barn hushed, the night wrapping around them like a cocoon. Luna curled tighter around Wags, her leg aching but her heart full. The gift surrounded them, proof of the world's embrace, a circle of care that stretched beyond the straw. He chewed his bone, his tail wagging against her, and she rested her chin over him, her purr a hymn to their shared strength. The farm slept, but the barn glowed with a quiet magic. Luna and Wags weren't alone anymore, not in the way they'd been. The community had claimed them, their story a thread in its fabric, and that made the hollow in her chest feel smaller still. She'd fought for him, and now they'd fight. For her. Jane, the neighbors, the kids with their wide eyes. They were a family, yes, but part of something bigger too. Wags sighed, his bone forgotten as he nestled deeper, and Luna closed her eyes, the night soft around them. They'd faced. The fox faced the threat and come out stronger. Now, with the farm's heart behind them, they could rest, together always. Autumn gave way to winter, then bloomed into spring, the farm turning with the seasons like a slow, steady wheel. Inside the barn, Luna and Wags carved out a new normal, their days a tapestry of quiet joys woven from the threads of their survival. The fox's attack, Tommy's threat, the community's embrace, they'd faded into stories told over Jane's coffee, leaving behind a life that felt solid, rooted, theirs. Luna stretched out on her hay bale, her grey fur catching the morning, light as it streamed through the barn's cracks. The scratches from the fox had healed, leaving faint scars beneath her coat, a map of battles won. She was older now, her movements a touch slower, but her green eyes still gleamed with the same fierce love. Below her, Wags bounded across the floor. Not the tiny wobbly pup she'd found, but a scruffy dog now, his legs long and strong, his tail a blur of motion that lived up to his name. He'd grown into himself, a bundle of energy with a bark. That rang through the farm, yet he never strayed far from her. He chased a sunbeam now, pouncing where it danced on the wood, his paws kicking up straw. Luna's tail flicked, a ripple of amusement stirring her. He'd learned from her how to stalk, how to pounce, though his stealth was hopeless, his wagging tail a giveaway every time. She leapt down, landing beside him, and he spun, barking. With delight as he nudged her with his nose, she batted at him, a playful swipe, and he rolled onto his back, paws in the air, his grin wide and silly. Her purr rumbled, a sound that had become their anthem, and she licked his face, smoothing the fur he'd mussed. The days flowed like a river. Mornings were for play, Wags chasing her tail, Luna leading him on winding paths through the barn, their laughter a mix of barks and meows. Jane would come, her saucer of milk a ritual now, often with a bone or a biscuit tossed Wags' way. "Still shadowing her, huh?" she'd say, her voice warm with habit, and Luna would sit tall, her pride quiet but sure. Wags would flop against her, chewing his treat, and she'd groom him, her tongue tracing the lines of his growth. Afternoons brought rest. The sun would climb, spilling warmth through the barn, and they'd settle in their nest, expanded now with Mrs. Carter's blanket and a pile of straw Jane kept fresh. Luna curled around Wags, though he was bigger than her now, his head resting on her paws instead of under her chin. His breathing slowed, matching hers, and she'd nap too, her purr a steady hum that wrapped them in peace. The hollow in her chest was gone, filled by his presence, by the life they'd built. Evenings were for the farm. Wags would bound out to greet the neighbors, Sam with his jerky, the kids with their toys, his tail wagging like a metronome of joy. Luna followed, her steps measured, her eyes watchful but soft. The community had made them theirs, their story a legend that drew smiles and nods. "There's Luna and Wags," they'd say, and Wags would bark, prancing for attention, while Luna sat by, her dignity intact, but her heart open. Winter brought snow, blanketing the farm in white, and they'd huddle closer, Wags' warmth a furnace against her. Spring ushered in mud, and he'd track it in, earning a stern meow before she licked him clean. Summer hummed with heat, and they'd sprawl in the shade, Wags panting while Luna dozed, her purr a cool breeze between them. Through it all, he shadowed her hunter, her playmate, her family, and she guided him, her love a constant star. One late spring day, Jane lingered in the barn, her hands full of treats. Wags bounded over, snatching a bone, and Luna watched from her perch, her tail swaying. The farmer sat on a barrel, her eyes tracing them. "Look at you two," she said, her voice rough but tender. "Been a year since that storm, ain't it? And here you are, thick as thieves." Wags flopped beside Luna, gnawing his bone, and she rested her chin over him, her purr steady. Jane smiled, a rare, full thing. Reckon you've made this place home, ain't nobody gonna argue that now. The sun dipped low, painting the barn in hues of gold and dusk, and Jane left, her boots fading into the evening. Luna and Wags stayed, their nest a haven of warmth and memory. He'd grown taller than her, stronger, but he still pressed close, his head on her paws, his tail wagging softly. She licked his ears, a ritual as old as their bond, and he sighed, a sound of pure contentment. Night fell, the farm hushed under, a sky ablaze with stars. Luna gazed at Wags, his eyes half closed, his breath a steady rhythm against her. He was her shadow still, her Wags, but more now, her companion, through seasons, through battles, through quiet days like this. She'd saved him once, fought for him, and he'd saved her too, filling the hollow with his light. The barn settled into silence, save for the rustle of straw and the creak of wood. Luna curled tighter around him, her purr weaving through the dark, and felt the truth of it. This was their normal, their forever. The world could turn, seasons could shift, but here in this space they'd claimed they were whole, together always. The barn glowed with the soft light of a summer evening, the air thick with the scent of hay and honeysuckle drifting in from the fields. Luna lay sprawled in their nest, her grey fur silvered by time, her green eyes half closed as she watched Wags chew a bone nearby. He was a proper dog now, scruffy and strong, his tail a constant wag that stirred the straw, but still her shadow never far from her side. The years had deepened their bond, etching it into the barn's wood, the farm's rhythm, their every quiet moment. It was a life built from a stormy night, a life they'd fought for and won. The barn door creaked open, and Luna's ears twitched, her gaze lifting. Old Jane stepped in, her boots softer now, her steps slower with age. Behind her trailed two small figures, her grandchildren, a boy with a mop of curls and a girl with pigtails, their eyes wide with curiosity. Wags barked, a joyful greeting, and bounded over, his tail whipping like a windmill. Luna rose, stretching her stiff legs, and followed at her own pace, her purr rumbling faintly as she joined him. Jane settled onto a barrel, easing down with a groan, and patted the space beside her. "Come here, you two," she said, her voice rough but warm. The kids scrambled up, giggling as Wags nosed their hands, his tongue darting out for a lick. Luna sat at Jane's feet, her tail curling around Wags, her presence steady and calm. The farmer pulled a biscuit from her pocket, breaking it in two, one for Wags, one for the kids to share, and smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Gran, is that the cat and dog you always talk about?" The girl asked, her pigtails bouncing as she leaned forward. "The ones from the story?" "Sure is, Ellie," Jane said, nodding. "Luna and Wags, best pair this farm's ever seen." The boy, his curls falling into his eyes, grinned. "Tell. Us again, Gran, the whole thing." Jane chuckled, a low, raspy sound, and leaned back, her gaze drifting to Luna and Wags. "All right then. Settle in." She cleared her throat, her voice taking on the cadence of a tale well told. It started with a storm years back, a wild, wet night that shook the farm to its bones. Luna here, she was just a barn cat then, keeping to herself. After a hard winter took her kittens. But that night she heard something, a whimper, faint and lost. Ellie's eyes widened, her hands clutching the biscuit. "The puppy!" "That's right," Jane said. "Wags, though he didn't have a name yet, was out there in a soggy box, left by the road." Luna found him, half drowned, and dragged him in. Didn't know what she was getting into, mind you. Cats don't raise dogs, but she curled round him, kept him warm, fed him what she could, and that was just the start. The boy giggled as Wags flopped against Luna, his bone. "Forgotten. She fought a fox for him, didn't she?" Jane nodded, her smile softening. "Aye, she did. Snuck in one night, that fox, eyes on Wags like he was supper. Luna, small as she is, took it on, claws and yowls and all. Bled for him too, but she drove it off, kept him safe." Ellie reached down, her small hand hovering near Luna, who blinked up at her with quiet trust. "She's brave," she whispered. "Braver than most," Jane agreed. "And when my nephew Tommy tried to take Wags away, thinking a cat couldn't raise him, right, she stood her ground, hissed him right out the door. Ain't nobody messed with him since." The boy laughed, clapping his hands. And everybody came to see him. Word spread fast, Jane said, her voice warm with memory. Folks brought treats, toys, blankets, called them heroes. Luna and Wags, they turned this barn into something special. A home not just for them, but for all of us who watched him grow. The kids giggled as Wags rolled onto his back, paws in the air, and Luna licked his face, her purr steady and deep. Jane's eyes glistened, her rough hand resting on the barrel. They're old now, these two. Been through storms and fights and seasons aplenty. But they're still here, still together, like they were that first night. Ellie slid off the barrel, crouching to hug Wags, who wagged harder, then gently patted Luna's head. They're the best, Gran. They are, Jane said, her voice dropping soft. And here's the thing, you two, sometimes the smallest hearts teach us the biggest lessons. Luna didn't care Wags was a pup, not a kitten. She loved him. Anyway, fought for him, made him hers. That's what family is, choosing each other no matter what. The boy nodded, his curls bouncing. Like us and you, Gran? Like us, Jane said, ruffling his hair. Now, go on, give 'em. Some love before we head in. The kids swarmed Luna and Wags, their laughter filling the barn as they cuddled and cooed. Luna purred louder, her eyes half closed, while Wags barked, soaking up the attention. Jane watched, her smile a quiet glow, then stood, her shadow stretching, long in the dusk. Come on, you rascals, supper's waiting. They scampered out, waving back, and Jane lingered, her gaze on Luna and Wags. You've done good, you two, she murmured, then shuffled off, the door creaking shut behind. The barn hushed, the evening settling soft and warm. Luna curled tighter around Wags, his head on her paws, his tail wagging faintly as he drifted off. She rested her chin over him, her purr a hymn to their years, the storms, the fights, the love that had carried them through. The kids' laughter echoed in her ears, Jane's words a gentle weight. The smallest hearts teach us the biggest lessons, and that was their legacy. A tale of a cat and a pup who chose each other, who built a family from a rainy night and a fierce heart. It lived in the barn, in the farm, in the stories told to wide-eyed kids. Luna closed her eyes, Wags' warmth against her, and felt it. They'd taught the world something true, that love knows no bounds, that family is a choice, and that even the smallest among us can leave the biggest mark. The stars shone bright, the farm slept, and Luna and Wags rested. Together always, their love a light that would never fade.